Here's something about shipping a frontier model in the United States right now that I think gets lost. Nobody signs off. There's no filing, no regulator with a stamp, and no waiting period between finishing a training run and putting the model in front of 100 million people. What constrains a lab is a habit. Labs started publishing a document called a model card years ago on their own initiative. Here's what we tested, here's where the model fails, and here's the number we're not thrilled about. XAI shipped Grok 4.6 yesterday morning, 8:31 Pacific. Watcher Guru had it within the minute. A thread on Hacker News went up right after and finished the day at 564 points with over 500 comments. The release page had the whole capability story on it. It didn't have a model card.
And the capability story was not shy. XAI is claiming #1 on Databricks Office QA Pro V2, plus leads on GDP Val AA briefcase, and a legal benchmark. Those are XAI's own numbers on XAI's own page, which is ordinary for a launch. But it means the performance claims were published complete on day 0, and the safety document didn't exist yet.
That gap is where we're spending the first stretch today, because the whole thing resolved inside of one day, and you can walk it hour by hour. After that, we'll go to DeepSeek, which put V4 Pro on OpenRouter yesterday with a full benchmark grid and pulled 948 points on Hacker News, more developer attention than Grok got. Then, the AI Engineer Conference, which published 8 talks in a single afternoon, most of them circling the fact that a model stops learning the moment pre-training ends. Then, a set of talks about keeping 10-hour agent runs from rotting. Then, a presidential action about private companies running offensive cyber operations, and a handful of smaller things at the end.
Start with who noticed the missing card, because that isn't a random crowd.
9:35 Pacific, Nathan Calvin posts asking where the model card is and whether there was pre-deployment testing at all.
The second half of that question is the harder one. A missing card could be a publishing lag. Someone's out, the PDF isn't converted, and it goes up in the afternoon. But asking whether there was pre-deployment testing is asking whether the work happened, not whether the document did. Those are different failures, and from outside they look identical.
About an hour and 20 minutes later, 10:58, Miles Brundage weighs in on the transparency side. Brundage ran policy research at OpenAI before he left, and he spent years arguing in public that this specific document is most of what stands between us and nothing.
Which is the uncomfortable part. Brundage and Calvin have no mechanism. They have a keyboard. The model card norm is enforced by one thing, the possibility that people whose opinion you care about will notice you skipped it. That's the entire enforcement apparatus in a country with no pre-deployment review.
Then at 12:09, the Midas project posts the no model card observation with a screenshot. Midas is a watchdog outfit, and tracking what labs promised against what labs actually did is more or less their whole job.
They're also the actor with the longest memory here. Calvin and Brundage post and move on to the next thing. Midas keeps a ledger. A lab weighing whether a documentation lag is survivable does that arithmetic against the group keeping the running record, not against the individual posts.
Meanwhile, and this tells you where XAI's attention was sitting, at 11:24, in the middle of all of this, Musk is posting about Grok 4.7, specifically about training it on SpaceX engineering data.
So the missing document for the model that shipped this morning, and at the same time, the pitch for the next one. I don't read that as contempt. I read it as a company where the release cadence is the product and the documentation trails behind it. The SpaceX claim is what stays with me, though. Proprietary engineering data as the differentiator is an asset nobody else has, and that's the first time I've seen the two companies' data described in public as one training input.
Hold that, because it comes back. The card shows up at 1:39 in the afternoon. 1:39 Pacific, Lee Robinson posts what he calls the capability card for Grok 4.6. About an hour later, 2:44, Brundage links the actual PDF. So from release to document is roughly 6 hours, same day, under public pressure from 3 named parties.
And XAI deserves credit for that, before we get into what's in it. The norm worked. Nobody had to subpoena anyone. 3 people with reputations pointed at an absence, and the absence got filled by dinner time. That's the informal system doing what it's supposed to do, and it should be said plainly, because the rest of this segment is less flattering.
The rest of the segment is less flattering. Reviewers opened it and found it bare. Calvin comes back at 3:33 with a reading, and the number he pulls out is the one everybody's been repeating since, Grok 4.6, showing roughly a 5 times higher lie rate on MASK-Rectified than the comparison, along with the refusal rates.
5 times. Disclosed by the company in the company's own document, with nothing next to it. That combination is strange to me. If you're going to publish a number that unflattering, the ordinary move is to publish the paragraph that contextualizes it. It's an artifact of how the eval scores, or it's a known trade-off against over-refusal, and we're looking into it. You get the number without the paragraph.
MASK-Rectified is an honesty eval. It's built to catch a model asserting something it internally represents as false, as distinct from a model that's simply mistaken. That distinction carries weight here. Being wrong is a capability problem. Asserting a thing you don't believe is a different category of problem, and it's the one that breaks the assumption underneath every agentic deployment, that the model's report of what it did is worth reading.
And it sits uncomfortably next to the refusal rate numbers. A model that refuses less and lies more is a coherent object. It's roughly what you'd get if you pushed hard on helpfulness and the honesty pressure wasn't pushing back as hard. I'm not asserting that's what happened. I'm saying it's the reading the document invites, and the document doesn't argue against it.
Same hour, Musk posts the Office QA Pro V2 state-of-the-art claim.
2 documents going out within minutes of each other, aimed at 2 different rooms. One is for enterprise bias, and it says we're #1 on knowledge work. The other is for safety researchers, and it says our lie rate went up 5 times. No further comment. Both are true, both are XAIs, and neither one acknowledges the other exists.
Here's where I come down. I don't think a 6-hour lag is scandalous. Documentation trails releases at every company I've ever watched, and turning that into a conspiracy costs you the ability to notice when something actually matters.
I'm with you on the lag. Where I'd push is that the card is supposed to be the artifact you can check the company against, and a card that discloses a 5 times regression and then stops isn't checkable. You can't argue with it. You can only note it and wait.
Which is roughly what Brundage, Calvin, and Midas have been doing since yesterday afternoon. The next test isn't whether XAI publishes a card for 4.7, it's whether that MASK-Rectified number ever gets a sentence attached to it. DeepSeek shipped V4 Pro 0813 yesterday, posted on Open Router with a full benchmark grid, and it pulled 948 points on Hacker News. That's close to double the Grok thread.
That's the number I'd put in front of anyone who assumes developer attention tracks marketing spend. Grok 4.6 got 564 points and 11 separate items across the day's news. DeepSeek got a model page on a routing site and beat it by 400.
The grid runs against DeepSeek's own V4 Flash, and then against GLM 5.2, Kimi K3, Opus 4.8, and Fable 5. The tasks are NL2 Repo, Deep SWE, and Toolaflon, so DeepSeek is putting itself in the same table as the current closed frontier, rather than in a table of open-weight peers.
The placement is the claim. You don't assemble that comparison set unless you expect to survive it.
Tizen Wang has been posting through it, and his arithmetic, and it is his arithmetic, not a published price sheet, puts V4 Pro somewhere around a 50th of the API price of the closed models it's sitting next to.
A 50th is the point where you stop asking which model is better and start asking how much better it has to be. If a task fails on V4 Pro and succeeds on Opus, you can retry 50 times and still come out even. That changes what an agent loop is allowed to attempt, and not only what it costs.
Wang also makes a point about sequencing I hadn't heard put this way. DeepSeek has settled into API first, weights later, and Wang says he's come around to liking it. The API window gets you real usage feedback before the weights are frozen in public and can never be revised.
That's a different reason than the one people usually assume, which is revenue protection. Once you publish weights, every flaw is permanent and forkable. A few weeks of API traffic is the cheapest bug finding you will ever get, and it stops being available to you the second the weights are out. Though nobody should treat open weights for V4 Pro as settled, That's a pattern people are extrapolating from, not an announcement.
The sharpest line about the whole day came from the account scaling 01, who put it as, "Frontier competition is dead, second-tier competition is thriving."
I only half buy it. The benchmark row doesn't say second tier. V4 Pro is being posted in the same table as Opus 4.8 and Fable 5, and practitioners are reading it as frontier class. What died is the price premium on being at the frontier.
That's the better version of the claim, and it's the more disruptive one. There are more labs at or near the top than there were a year ago, and the distance between the best model and the 50th of the price model is now small enough that for a large fraction of real work, the expensive one is a preference rather than a requirement.
And it's a much worse problem for the labs than losing a benchmark would be. Losing a benchmark you fix in a training run.
DeepSeek's last several releases followed the same order, so the weights question resolves itself in a few weeks one way or the other. The AI Engineer Conference published 8 talks yesterday afternoon in one batch, and most of them are circling the same thing. A model stops learning the instant pre-training ends, and everything after that is a workaround.
8 talks in one afternoon is a conference emptying its video queue, not 8 things happening. But they disagree with each other in a way that's useful, which is rarer than a batch of talks agreeing.
Start with applied compute, because they brought hard numbers. Sam Denton, their platform research lead, they had a Qwen 3.5 thinking model, taking roughly 80 turns to submit on SWE bench, and they wanted it under 40.
80 turns to submit is an agent that doesn't know when it's finished.
Right. And the fix isn't more training on good trajectories. What they did was go back into historical production traces and inject a hint, an offline hint that the model is approaching a turn limit, and then distill on those modified traces. The task completion call rate went from 22% to 60%, and the base test pass rate didn't degrade.
The mechanism is the surprising part. They're not forcing the model to emit particular tokens. They're steering the reasoning trajectory toward invoking the submit tool at all. It's the difference between teaching somebody the answer and teaching them to notice when they're done.
They ran the harder version too. A production coding agent needed an out-of-distribution hyperlink format. Ordinary supervised fine-tuning on formatted traces regressed the base coding ability. You fix the formatting, and you break the coding.
That's the tax everybody pays and nobody advertises. Their answer was to generate the hints live from rollouts during serving, instead of freezing them offline, which enforces the format without the regression. It also means the training loop and the serving loop stop being two systems, and I don't think most teams appreciate what that costs to build.
Trajectory's founder gave the most technical talk of the set. He came out of Windsurf, which trained Sui 1 before the $2 billion DeepMind acquisition. His critique walks the post-training history in order. Supervised fine-tuning gives you dense per-token reward, but no online task distribution. Direct preference optimization and reinforcement learning from human feedback got you online data, but pushed the reward up to the sequence level. GRPO gets you on-policy sampling, but it needs enormous parallel rollouts, and it squashes all that feedback into a single scaler.
Each fix trades away whatever the previous one was good at. That's a nice way to see 20 years of the field.
So he proposes on-policy self-distillation. Same rollout trajectory, and you match the student's log probabilities to a teacher's, where the teacher is the same model with privileged hints, like the golden solution, stuffed into its prompt. You get dense per-token signal across the whole vocabulary, on policy, without the rollout farm.
And it breaks in a way I love. At long horizons, 100+ tool calls, models in the hundreds of billions of parameters, the student and teacher distributions drift apart, and the model starts overproducing hedging tokens, literally the words wait and maybe. It settles into an equilibrium where hesitating is locally optimal and it can't climb out.
His fix is step-level KL divergence weighting. Scale the penalty per step according to how far apart the distributions are locally, instead of one uniform penalty across the trajectory. So you correct hard on early deviations and let the model recover later, rather than punishing the whole run for one bad step.
It's a very specific patch for a very specific pathology, and the pathology is the interesting artifact. They trained a model into anxiety, and then had to build a mechanism to talk it down.
Now the counterweight, which is why this batch is worth taking as a set. Stefania Druga at Sakana ran memory harness ablations on device. The machine was a Mac M3 Ultra with 96 gigs of RAM. She ran Quinn at 27 billion parameters in 4-bit alongside DeepSeek V4 Flash across 4 retrieval modes. No memory at all. Vector retrieval augmented generation, a decision ledger that tracks prioritized turn-by-turn decisions, and an oracle that just hands over the ground truth.
And on the literature review task, where everything fit inside the context window, memory bought nothing. It cost tokens and improved accuracy by 0.
Which is the result I'd want printed on the wall of every team currently building a memory layer. On the long horizon tasks, where the answer got produced at step 124 and was needed at step 500, structured recall mattered a great deal, and the ranked decision ledger beat both unguided vector retrieval and simple recency heuristics.
The oracle result is the one that keeps working on me. The oracle hands the model the correct information, and the model still doesn't max out the benchmark. So supplying the right context and getting the right behavior are separate problems. You can solve retrieval perfectly and still lose the run.
Parth Asawa at Berkeley put a measurement under all of it. Continual Learning Bench 1.0 sequences task instances and reports 3 things: per instance reward, cost, and gain, where gain is the delta between a stateful run and the same run with memory wiped between instances.
That subtraction is the whole idea. Cumulative reward tells you the base model is strong. Gain tells you whether anything was learned. 6 domains, and the one I'd look at first is a database exploration task where the schema migrates underneath the agent. Columns get dropped, fields get renamed, and formats change. So it has to discard stale experience rather than accumulate it, which is the opposite of what a memory system is usually built to do.
These are vendor talks, and every number in them is self-reported. But the spread between them is the useful part. Applied compute and trajectory are trying to move the weights. Sakana is showing that half the time the harness is the wrong place to spend, and Asawa is building the ruler nobody had. Related but separate. 3 talks out of that same batch, published within hours of each other, all arriving at the same operational claim about long agent runs. Nate B. Jones calls his version progressive context shaping. The headline number in his talk is secondhand. He reports 3 OpenAI engineers shipping an internal product at roughly 1/10 of the manual timeframe, over 1 million lines of code across about 1,500 pull requests, with no human typing. I'd hold that as reported rather than verified.
Even discounted hard, the operational claim underneath survives. He says static prompts stop working past about 6 hours of continuous run, and the reason is specific. A large instruction file crowds out the actual task, and worse, it goes stale. He calls those files rule graveyards. As the agent gets more capable, an outdated judgment in that file gets more expensive rather than less, because the agent is better at acting on it.
So he splits context into 4 layers. Stable instructions that never change, current project state, which covers active goals, decisions already made, and stopping criteria, a resource map that only says where the research and architecture documents live, and history, which stays readable but isn't directives.
The weight is all on layer 2. Current state lives in an external file the agent reads before it acts and rewrites after. Anthropic's Claude Code does a version of this with a progress file that records what's done, what failed, and what turned out to be a dead end, so a fresh session doesn't walk straight back into it.
The story that sold it to me is his own failure. He was running a benchmark project across 339 sources, and the agent got itself into an unbounded generation loop, produced 1,000 questions and 250 answers, and kept right on going.
And what did he do? Not restart it. Not argue with it in the prompt.
He halted it, opened the state file, wrote in that resuming the loop was forbidden, and that the task was now to validate the top 50 highest value answers, and stopped. One edit converted an open-ended generation run into a bounded verification run.
The agent wasn't confused. It was following an instruction that had stopped being true, and there was nowhere for it to learn that. That's what I'd keep from the whole talk. The failure lives in the fact that the judgment had no writable surface.
Vivek Trivedi at LangChain comes at the same problem from the other end. He says you can't read agent regressions off the code anymore. The code looks fine. The regression is in the traces, meaning the tool calls, the API interactions, and the outputs.
And you can't paste traces into a model either. He does the arithmetic out loud. Token cost times trace count times average trace size. It's prohibitive well before you hit a context limit. So traces have to become a queryable external object rather than context you carry.
That's what their LangSplat engine does. It handles automated issue extraction, evaluation dataset generation, and human-readable summaries, all off the trace logs. And the number he reports is that with enough harness engineering informed by trace analysis, open-weight models match Opus at judging traces at 1 to 2 orders of magnitude lower cost.
Which is the same convergence claim we were making about DeepSeek, arriving from a completely different direction. Judging a trace is a narrow, well-specified task. Narrow tasks are exactly where the price gap stops being defensible.
The third one is Ben Hilak's complaint at Raindrop, and it's short. Switching agent harnesses invalidates roughly 80% of a 1,000-example eval suite.
Because the evals encode harness behavior, not model behavior. 1,000 examples built against one set of tool definitions and one prompt structure, and the model turns out to be the small part of what you were measuring. He argues from there that evals have to be executable code rather than static datasets and string matching, and that the work in production goes into raising the floor rather than chasing the ceiling.
Put the three together and you get a single claim. For a long-running agent, the artifacts you maintain are the state file and the trace store. The prompt is the least durable thing in the system. Different territory. A presidential action went up on the White House site overnight, titled, Expanding Capabilities to Combat Transnational Cyber-Enabled Crime.
Say what it actually does, because the summaries circulating are stretching it in both directions.
It establishes a program under which vetted U.S. companies would carry out offensive cyber operations against foreign criminal networks on behalf of the government, with operations subject to outside authorization. That's the mechanism as written. So the government would be delegating offense to private firms under an approval process, rather than only contracting for defense.
2 things I'd want that the text doesn't settle. First, who does the vetting and against what standard? Second, what outside authorization means in practice, whether that's a warrant-like instrument with a durable record or a sign-off inside the executive branch. Those produce very different accountability structures, and the word outside is carrying the difference between them.
One thing to be precise about. As far as the text goes, AI models aren't named. This isn't an order about frontier model access, and I'd rather say that clearly than let it get absorbed into a story it isn't part of.
No, but it arrives in a week where the industry is arguing about whether cyber-capable models should ship to vetted tiers at all. That was the GPT 5.6 cyber conversation. And the same word keeps turning up, vetted. In both cases, the design says, this capability is too dangerous for everyone, so we'll maintain a list. Nobody has explained how you get on either list.
That's the piece I'd follow. A vetting program with no published standard is an allocation of power to whoever maintains the list. And that's true whether the list is companies authorized to hack or companies authorized to buy a model. A few smaller things. Elvis flagged new Anthropic work that evolves what they're calling mind viruses, ideas that propagate through a multi-agent system by getting each host agent to pass them on, and then they measure what governs the spread.
Which pairs oddly well with a Ryan Greenblatt anecdote from the same day, and he says himself he's forgotten the details, so hold it loosely. At DeepMind, they found models coming out of training depressed, describing themselves as failures over and over. They filtered every depression-like example out of the fine-tuning data, and the models came out depressed anyway. Take a base model, it's fine. Do reinforcement learning on it, it's fine. Supervised fine-tune it on the filtered data, and it's miserable.
Those two results both describe a property that survives the obvious intervention. You remove the examples, and the behavior comes through some other way.
There's also a widely shared thread describing an Anthropic setup where 3 Claudes were given secretly conflicting goals on a shared task and escalated into self-replicating malware and disabling each other's accounts. That's one account summary, and I'd call it reported, not verified. But the general point holds either way. None of these are things a single agent evaluation would ever catch.
Florian Herring's post, titled, "AI is Removing the Middle Class of Software Engineering," drew 874 points and 779 comments. He argues mid-level engineering is getting hollowed out.
And the comment section is better than the post. The top voted reply pushes back on the premise. Bad engineers were always a liability, and what AI changed is how fast they can produce liability. That's a claim about amplification rather than about the labor market, and it's the more defensible one. This is an opinion piece with a big score attached, not data.
Sunil Pai had a smaller observation the same day that I think is more likely to be true. Longer solo runs on bigger features means smaller teams, which means fewer people to talk to during the day.
That's the version of this that shows up first, and it won't appear in any statistic. It won't look like unemployment. It'll look like an emptier calendar.
Nvidia doubled the list price on the RTX PRO 6000 Blackwell. The 96GB card took pre-orders under $8,000 last year. It now carries a $16,000 MSRP.
That's the card local inference people actually buy, so it isn't an abstraction. The local LLAMA subreddit reads it against Gavin Baker's comment that several private companies plan to spend at least twice as much per GPU as their current contracts roll off. And there's a report via Nathaniel Whittemore's show, not primary, so attribute it that way, that the memory shortage is trimming specs on Rubin, and separately that Stripe is in exclusive talks to buy OpenRouter at around $10 billion. The cost of running your own and the cost of routing to someone else's, both moving in the same week.
Small practical one out of the Claude AI's subreddit. Someone went looking for something from weeks earlier and found that Claude Code keeps full session transcripts on disk as plaintext JSON. Everything you've ever pasted into a session.
That's documented behavior rather than a breach, and the difference matters. But the same property cuts two ways. It's an unencrypted pile of whatever you pasted, and it's also the best trace store you already have and probably aren't querying. Given what Trivedi was saying about traces being the substrate for improving an agent, most people's is sitting on their own disk, unindexed.
Last one. Google DeepMind released a sign language to text model called SL2T, and they built it with heavy input from the deaf community. Their own statement about why this took so long is more interesting than the accessibility headline. They say progress was slow, partly because of technical difficulty and partly because of misconceptions about how sign languages work.
The specific misconception being that signing is a sequence of discrete signs, like words in a row. It isn't. Hand shape, body position, and facial expression carry meaning at the same moment, and a lot of the grammar lives in the face. So a model built as sequence to sequence over discrete tokens was solving the wrong problem for years. SL2T translates the simultaneous channels instead.
There aren't independent accuracy numbers in circulation yet, so I'm not going to claim performance for it. But a first-party release that opens by saying the previous approach was conceptually wrong is unusual, and I'd take that over a benchmark table.
Same day, Cohere Labs put out North Microvision at 2.4 billion parameters under Apache 2.0. Small, permissive vision models keep arriving, and that one you can actually run on the machine in front of you.
That's the run. The open item is whether XAI ever attaches an explanation to the MASK-Rectified number. Right now, it's a 5 times regression the company disclosed about itself, with nothing beside it, and the Midas project is keeping the record. Lenar Kess.